Welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jay Sanderson. I have the honor and privilege to be the president and the CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles. I hope you and your families are staying healthy and safe. We at the Federation, as you, I'm sure, are seeing in our emails and seeing across the community, we have spent the last 6 months keeping this community safe and healthy and doing everything we can to support the most vulnerable in our community and support our treasured Jewish institutions. But while we're doing all that, we of course continue our support for a lot of the things that are happening in Israel. And it's our honor and privilege today to be able to hear from our Consul General, Dr. Hillel Newman. Dr. Newman hails from Cape Town, has spent a tremendous amount of time in the foreign ministry, was the ambassador to Uzbekistan. He is not just a great friend to the Jewish community in Los Angeles and a great leader here locally, but he has spent most of his career dealing with foreign affairs issues as they relate to the state of Israel. We are now living through a historic agreement with the UAE, and Dr. Hillel Newman is going to address that, and then we're going to open it up for questions, and I'm going to talk to him about things as varied as other relationships that are brewing for Israel in the coming weeks and months, as well as how Israel is dealing with COVID-19. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our partner and friend, Consul General Dr. Hillel Newman.
Thank you, Jay. It is really my honor to partner with you, the President and CEO of the Jewish Federation, and to work so closely together with the Jewish Federation for the interests of the Jewish community and Israel. It is truly my pleasure and honor to be invited together with you and to partner with you on this briefing. Thanks for the invitation and my deep greetings to the entire team of the Jewish Federation. I'd also like to add greetings to the entire Jewish community and all those who are watching. We know these are challenging times. We wish health, we wish prosperity to everyone. Okay, let's perhaps I'll just do like a bird's eye view of the different issues that are on the table. And then of course, we'll open it up for your questions and the spectators' questions on any issue that they wish. Our agenda is always full. That's one thing about Israel and the Israeli agenda and the geopolitical situation, that we never have a dull moment. So as we speak, we have on the one hand, peace initiatives which are moving forward, which are very optimistic. And for a change, we have good news coming out of the Middle East. On the other hand, we of course have the challenges and threats which face us, which are not new, but some of them are growing all the time. And we have, of course, the COVID-19, the government in Israel, the political situation in Israel. All these things are on our table. So those are, in a big picture, those are the big issues, I would say. I'll just relate briefly to some of them. Next week, we're expecting the official ceremony in the White House of the signing of the agreement between Israel and the UAE. I'm sure we'll talk about that and the significance of it. And we also heard that this week, Serbia and Kosovo have announced that they will relocate their embassies in Israel, will have official relations with Kosovo. Things are moving in different directions, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in the questions and answers. I think there's a growing realization in the entire Middle East that Israel is more of an ally than anything else. They understand the benefits that can come out of the good relationship with Israel. And this includes Persian Gulf states, Arab states, Muslim states around the world. I can just mention that we're talking with at least 5 to 10 other states about future relations and a breakthrough in our relations. We hope that something will move. At the same time, not all is good in the Middle East. We have the usual threats. We have Hezbollah and Lebanon, unstable Lebanon, which sometimes when there's instability in our region, then somehow it spills over in accusations against Israel and attacks against Israel. So we are wary. We also have the Gaza Strip with the Hamas. We have Syria, where Iran is trying to entrench themselves and establish footholds in Syria. Israel is doing a lot of activity in order to prevent that. We have other issues, big issues like the ICC and European relations with Israel, and other items on our global agenda. In general, I would say that things with Europe are also moving in an interesting format with our new, what we call geometrical relationships. That's like the trilateral relationship with Cyprus and Greece, and our relationship with the Visegrad states and the Baltic states. So we've got things moving in different directions. Generally, we can be optimistic. Regarding COVID-19, we are hopeful that a vaccine will come out. Israel is working on a vaccine, the United States is working on a vaccine. And from the beginning, Israel had a very unique approach to COVID-19. Things are changing in Israel, and we can talk about that as well if anybody wants to ask a question. The political situation in Israel is not that stable as we thought it would be. The National Emergency Unity Government is not entirely stable. We will see how things develop in that arena as well. And people are invited to ask questions in that field as well. Thank you.
So, well, you put a lot on the table. Let's start with the current relationship with the UAE, and you know, as well as I know, that Israel has had back channel relationships with many moderate Arab countries for a great deal of time. Why now did this occur? And is there a broader implications of this new relationship, this more public relationship with the UAE than we're reading in the newspaper?
Yes, let me just add that I had a personal role in this process, which has been taking place over decades. But 1 year ago, in July 2019, I visited UAE together with our foreign minister at the time, Israel Katz. And therefore, I played a part, although it was a minor part, but I could witness the eventualities and as things were moving on with my own eyes. And already then it was quite clear that we're moving in the right direction. There were just concerns of UAE that had to be addressed. And the interesting factor about this whole process with the Persian Gulf and UAE and other countries is that their concerns of the past few years have not been with Israel in any way. They were quite confident in the direction that they were taking in moving forward with Israel. Their concerns were more from the ramifications or the negative impacts that they would get from, for instance, Iran, from the radical Islam, and from elements out there that could damage their interests. For instance, I can't quote anybody, but you can understand that their concerns were, for instance, they have tankers, they have oil fields, they have infrastructure which can be attacked. And they needed some reassuring of some kind that their infrastructure will not be attacked or at least be defended in the time of need. I just add also that these countries have a lot of interests with Israel, with the United States. Everyone has their wish list with the United States and with Israel. And the time has come, you ask why now? I would say the time has come now because of a coming together of different things. First, confidence in the fact that the administration and that Israel and other players in the international community will be attentive to their interests and to protecting their needs. They needed to have that security. The second, I think they understood fully what type of benefits they can get from Israel. And they understood that the benefits are worth more than all these years of confrontation. They didn't get anything out of the confrontation. They understood that Israel is an ally and not an enemy. And the third aspect, which unites everybody today, at least the Sunni moderate Muslims, is the fact that they understand the threat from Iran. They understand that Israel and the United States have now got a clear position in confronting Iran. And that was also a key player in their decision to move forward. I would just add in this aspect that there have been signals over the past year or two, like for instance, the fact that Bahrain allowed an open meeting of its foreign minister with Israel's foreign minister, the fact that Israel was invited to Expo, the fact that flights were allowed over Saudi Arabia from Israel to the Far East. These were signals coming out. And their real concern was what's happening, what is the response going to be on the Arab street? And these signals were giving that type of signal that they could then measure the response. What is the retaliation? What is the response on the Arab street? They are a victim of their own indoctrination. They've been teaching and preaching hatred towards Israel and towards Jews for many years. And now they are a victim of that hatred because they have to try and bridge that gap and bring the people closer to the directions they're taking in the future.
So that poses a question that I was thinking about when this happened, which was, right, governments can make deals, governments can create relationships, but the real issue in terms of the Middle East are the people themselves. So are there steps in place that you're aware of to actually have this thing funnel down to the people in the streets and in terms of their feelings about Israel?
Yes, that's a very good question because, you know, we've been through the peace with Jordan and Egypt. And many people say, oh, this peace now with UAE is not that significant because you already have peace with Egypt and Jordan, and UAE, you never had an open confrontation anyway. So I just like to say that this peace with UAE has very special significance because for a change, it's coming as a warm peace. It's coming as peaceful peace. No price to pay for our peace with UAE. It's a mutual recognition and a mutual understanding that we both give legitimacy to each other and work together for the future. Now, look, if you just look at the UAE agreement, since it was declared, already a flight flew from Israel, direct flight, unprecedented flight, directly from Israel to the UAE with an Israeli dogtail, and Saudi Arabia allowed it entry into its airspace. And then Saudi Arabia announced that it will no longer limit any flights, Israeli flights, over its airspace. And teams went out, and teams engaged in tourism, in health issues, in visas, in diplomatic issues, innovation, cooperation in innovation, even cooperation in science. And more than 170 draft agreements were arranged during that short visit. So you can see that there is a genuine interest to move fast and to move in all directions. I can tell you, for instance, tourism. Thousands of Israelis are interested in visiting UAE already, and UAE citizens are interested in visiting Israel. We've already got great interest. Even in LA, I've got appeals about this issue. So we can see that this is going to be a very warm peace. And the difference is that it comes more from the heart. It's an ideological break of that taboo of not recognizing Israel. It's a break of that ideological taboo. With Egypt and Jordan, there was always that doubt whether they're doing it for interests, for territory, for water. Here with UAE, it's just a genuine peaceful peace, a peace out of strength of both sides.
So it sounds like you're implying that this could be the beginning of many more similar deals with moderate Arab countries. Is that what you believe?
Yes, I do. Our belief is that even by the end of this year, we will see at least one other country join, maybe even two. And as I said earlier, we're talking to between 5 to 10 states about initiating diplomatic relations with Israel. I'm talking about countries that we do not have diplomatic relations with. So we're talking about a regional issue. We're talking about even global. Not all the countries I'm talking about are in the Persian Gulf, but they all belong to what we call either the Arab League or the Muslim bloc. So it has ramifications, it has regional significance, definitely.
So that leads me to something that's troubled me, which is among the countries that have been named as potentially opening up diplomatic relationships with Israel is Sudan. And having spent a lot of time in Africa and having made a film about genocide, if I was picking the least likely friend I'd like to have in the world, Sudan would be at the top of the list. So help us understand if any of this is true and how you would see Israel, the country that has welcomed and been a haven for Holocaust survivors, creating a meaningful relationship with probably the #1 genocide country in the world right now.
Yes, I tell you, we don't name specific countries that are like next in line. We've always been asked, okay, what's the next country? What's the next country? All I can say is that we have a few countries that are in line, and they're in line waiting to renew relations with Israel. And we believe that there will be one or two by the end of this year. I do not think that Sudan is the top of the list right now. Sudan, look, we have never had a policy of regime change. We have never had a policy of intervening in domestic affairs of a foreign country. So we don't have that pleasure also of choosing, who we can have relations with and who we can't. There are some extreme cases that Israel might go with the Western community, the Western bloc of the UN and the United States, and have some limitations in its foreign diplomatic ties with a specific country. There were countries like that in the past. Sudan, as far as I understand, is not on the top of the list of those countries that are boycotted by the Western community. Israel will respect any kind of decisions taken by the United States or the Western bloc, but we do not delve into domestic politics and start choosing countries that we do have relations with or not. We're happy for any country that comes forth and wants to have relations with Israel. Our hand is extended in peace and friendship to every country in the world. There's not one country in the world that we say we don't want peace with. Even Iran, our wish and our aspiration is for peace with Iran. We had good ties with Iran. We want to return to that day. The problem is that those regimes have chosen not to have relations with Israel and boycott Israel. So when they change their boycott regime and they accept Israel, that's a positive thing. And then we can talk with these countries about what changes should be initiated within the country. Very often you have more impact and more influence if you have relations than if you don't.
So let's change a little bit to the neighborhood. Obviously, this incident in Beirut was a game changer on so many levels. What are you hearing? What are you experiencing in terms of what's going on in the northern border with Israel?
Yeah, the northern border is not a cold border, unfortunately. And that includes also Lebanon and Syria. For many years, the Syrian border was colder because Assad, at least, he had some kind of control and he didn't want Israel to attack Syria in any way. So he had that sense of checks and balances of maintaining a peaceful border. Assad has lost control in his own country. You know that he brought in Iran and Russia and other international powers in order to kill the civil war in his own country. And unfortunately, Iran remains in Syria. We ask the question why Iran remains at all in Syria. There's no need for it anymore. We warned against this from the beginning. But Iran remains, and we know that Iran's intentions are not the good benefit of the people of Syria, but their hegemony, their power, and expanding their influence. And they've already expanded their influence from all the way from Tehran to Damascus to the Mediterranean, taking over countries and trying to take over other countries, involved malignly in Iraq, in Yemen, everywhere you can think of. So our northern border has two problems which are related to Iran. Our northern border, on the one hand, you have Lebanon with the Hezbollah, and the Hezbollah is a proxy group of Iran. And I think that there's a growing understanding within Lebanon that Hezbollah serves the interests of Iran. We've been saying this all the time. But now there's a growing understanding of this due to the explosion in Beirut, in the port of Beirut. There is a growing understanding that Hezbollah does not serve the interests of the Lebanese people. They still fear Hezbollah because Hezbollah rules by the gun. There's no real democracy. There's no real elections. When you have a militia like that running for elections and they're armed personnel with arms on them, that's not a free democratic election. But with the growing of understanding within Lebanon, we believe that there is hope that in the future, the Hezbollah will be demarginalized by the people of Lebanon. And perhaps even we'll go back to a period where we were on the brink of peace. We were on the brink of peace with Jamil at the time, and it was broken up because he was assassinated. But we can hopefully one day return to that if the people of Lebanon understand that Hezbollah is not serving their interests. I think that was an important aspect of the explosion in Beirut. The other northern border, which is hot, is Iran entrenched in the northern, on our northern border in Syria, and Israel has stated clearly that our policy is very clear. We will not allow Iran to attack Israel from Syria. And unfortunately, it's one of the places where we have direct confrontation between Iranian militias and Israel. We also have, of course, the Hamas in the southern border, which is also supported by Iran. So Iran's hands are in everything.
And I was going to get, you helped me because I was going on my east-west, north-south bit here, which is obviously you just helped me understand south. I would have said what, I didn't know if it was east or west Gaza, but it seems like Hamas is making some noise now. Is there a reason that you think they're making noise now?
Yes, Hamas is in a pickle because their policy is not succeeding. They're not bringing great benefits to the Palestinian people. They're not delivering on their promises to the Palestinian people. And they also understand that the tide is changing. In the past, the Palestinians, especially with people like Hamas, who have this no stand against Israel, negative stand against Israel, they always led this band of no peace and no recognition of Israel and 100% of their demands. And they held the veto. They held everyone hostage. And now they understand with the UAE peace deal that normalization between Israel and the Arab states can happen even without resolving the Palestinian issue. And that's a reverse of the false perceptions up to now. There was a false perception that we have to solve the Palestinian issue in its entirety before we can move forward with normalization with other countries. That was the Arab League's stand. That was, the position of the international community. And the truth is that it was the biggest obstacle to peace because it gave the Palestinians total veto power on everything. And they weren't ready for concessions. They're not internally ready for concessions. Abu Mazen cannot make the concessions. He's just too weak. So it left everything in the air. And now with the reverse, that we can move forward with normalization, which the UAE agreement has taught us. This means that the Palestinians no longer have veto power. Peace in the region doesn't have to go through Ramallah only. It can go directly with Abu Dhabi and with Qatar and Kuwait. We don't have to wait for the Palestinians. And perhaps this will bring the peace. So Hamas, I think, understands that they're in a bit of a pickle. They're losing the international community's support. They're losing the Arab world. And they're a stand of 3 no's of Khartoum, which they still continue, is old school. It's not the future, it's the past.
So let's go inward. So clearly we're having more conversations about whether this government is actually going to stick. And you are a member of this government. You're here because you're a part of the government. So I understand you're not going to be able to tell us everything, but what are you experiencing and what are you seeing in terms of will this coalition government continue, or will we have elections for the 934th time?
Yes, let me just clarify that. I'm a professional appointee.
Yes.
In the past, consul generals sometimes were political appointees, and sometimes they're professional. So the point about being a professional is that at least you represent the government, but you're not part of the government. And so I do represent the government, and if I felt that I could not represent the government of Israel, then I would resign. I feel that I can, and I feel that their policies are very logical and very right for this period of time. Regarding, they came together in an emergency unity government. That was a unique step in the entire global community. I don't think there's any other country in the world that the two conflicting parties came together. It's like the Democrats and Republicans coming together to make one government in order to meet the challenge of COVID-19. So they did that. And the main challenge, of course, is health and economy, bringing prosperity and economy to the people. We've suffered. Israel has suffered economically. There's a rise in unemployment, a rise in inflation. All these things we know. And therefore, the idea was that the national unity government will solve these issues. To say that everything is stable now, no. The differences are still there. Gantz represents a central leftist party. Netanyahu represents the central right party. And they do have their differences. And the question is whether they can bridge all of these differences and continue. We were on the brink of a breakup of the government about 2 or 3 weeks ago on the budget issue. We have different issues which can arise at any time and topple the government. The interesting fact is that there's no big difference between them on policy, on big policy issues. There's no big difference between them on how we should relate to COVID-19. These issues, there's hardly any daylight between them. But their differences are on mainly on domestic issues, religion and state issues, a little bit on the issue of the peace process, peace to prosperity, but it's not really, the whole issue of extending sovereignty has been taken off the table, suspended temporarily. So that's not the big issue between them. But issues can come between them and topple the government. And then we will go to elections. Now, the interesting thing is that the polls say right now that the opposition is changing in its structure. For instance, Lapid, who used to be the leader of the opposition, is dropping, is decreasing in the polls. And the one who's rising is actually Bennett from the right. So the biggest opposition to Netanyahu's government is actually from the right, from the more right, from Bennett. The latest polls showed that Bennett had 19 members of parliament, which positioned him as the largest opposition party, above Lapid. Lapid has internal problems. One of his dear colleagues and friends, Ofer Shelach, announced that he's going to run against him. And that, I think, was a big surprise to Lapid. Lapid's party never had internal elections for the leader of the party. So it means that Lapid will now be forced to go for internal elections where his good friend is running against him. So I think that it will decrease the party. It will have its effect. But things change dynamically in Israeli politics. So we'll see how things go.
So this is the first time in 6 months it's taken me 30 minutes to talk about COVID. Usually it's the first thing I talk about, and certainly the Federation has spent a great deal of its time pivoting to be able to address the needs in Los Angeles connected to the impact of this historic pandemic. And most of the people I'm sure on this webinar, and certainly me, are having least weekly, if not daily, conversations with friends and family in Israel about the spike, the not spike, going back to school. So where is Israel right now on dealing with COVID, and is Israel in the midst of a spike as it appears?
Yeah, I'll say the good and the bad. I don't hide anything. Let's start off with the good. The good is that Israel was one of the first to see the danger of COVID-19 and enforce restrictions. Israel was one of the first to start with a pilot program of getting out of the restrictions in order to allow for economic viability and sustenance. So in that aspect, that's one positive thing. The second thing is that Israel moved very quickly from purchasing and procurement abroad to self-producing. Through technology, Israel managed to self-produce very, very quickly. And we now produce all of our needs and even export and give humanitarian aid to many countries around the world. So that's also another aspect. Third thing which is positive about it is the high-tech approach. Israel from the beginning took a very, very high-tech geared approach. And the result is that we have many, many innovative ideas, ingenuity coming out of Israel, which will be the fields for the future. When we talk about the post-COVID-19 era, then we know that it will be artificial intelligence, modern technology, and many of the remote medicines, telemedicines, and things that are being developed now. And Israel is really on the leading wave of these things. Another positive thing that came out of it was the interesting connection between the IDF serving civil needs. So the IDF, Israel Defense Forces, went into the civil needs, and even where there were interesting meetings like IDF soldiers visiting Bnei Brak, ultra-religious families and giving them food, brought about situations that you would never see in normal circumstances, and situations for the good. That these types of populations that never meet all of a sudden come together in mutual assistance situations. What is the bad? The bad is that as we were one of the first in both ends, in the beginning and the ending of restrictions, we didn't completely end restrictions, but we eased them, that we are suffering what we might call a second wave or an increase of sickness. The government is following this very, very closely. We appointed a special emissary who represents the government. He's Professor Consul, who's now leading all the efforts in Israel to understand what should be the right policy and implement the policy as needed. You asked about what is the policy right now. I would say that the big picture is that Israel is now dividing its cities between what we call red hot zones and green zones. There are some cities which are regarded as hot zones, red cities, and they will be instructed to execute a kind of a curfew so that people will not go out of the homes after a certain hour in the evening until morning. This issue was debated very, very seriously in the cabinet of whether to execute a complete curfew of the entire country and whether to go back to a stay home order in the entire country. In the end, the cabinet decided not to do that. They decided to make this distinction between cities, execute a kind of a curfew on the red cities, and allow continued existence and living in the green cities. Even the red cities, during the day, they can work and they can continue their lives. They have restrictions about how far they can leave from their homes and things like that. And the curfew is only for the evenings. And the main idea is to try and prevent any kind of multi-event, large participation event, which is the same problem here in Los Angeles. The mayor of Los Angeles even spoke about the problem of events with many, many participants. So that's one of the issues. I think what I can, in a summary, I would say the morbidity is high, but the mortality is very low. And that's very interesting about Israel, that the mortality rate is one of the lowest in the world. The morbidity is high. And so our experts are also looking into that. Why is it the case that although the morbidity is high, the mortality is low?
If I was in Israel right now, which I wish I was, walking the streets of Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, would I be seeing mostly everyone wearing masks?
Yes, you would. I don't think on the beach people will keep to it very closely because you get a certain type of a character that goes there. But in the streets, generally, yes, they will wear masks, yes.
All right. Before I open it up to my colleague, Dan Gold, to take questions from the audience, I do want to talk about the one thing that concerns me the most, and that is the increasing polarization in this country and the impact it's having on support for Israel. It feels to me like we are every day, Israel is more and more challenged in terms of the way that Americans in politics, as well as Americans in general, are feeling about Israel. I've always worried about that, but I'm more worried about it now, and I've always worried about Israel's response to it. I think we've talked about that together. And I'm wondering how you're experiencing that now. Obviously, you can't be out in the streets in Los Angeles like you intended to be when you got here, but how you're seeing it by being here and how you think the Israeli government is responding to that issue.
Yeah, that is an issue of grave concern to Israel. Israel and the United States always enjoyed a strong bipartisan relationship. The strong alliance between Israel and the United States was beyond any individual and beyond any individual party. And if you look in the history, you go back in the history of the United States of America and the relations with Israel, you'll see that the interesting interchange of how close the Democratic Party was, and then the Republican Party joined, and then for years it was a strong bipartisan relationship, which one of the only issues in the American domestic politics that was agreed upon by all and was bipartisan was Israel. And I believe that, sometimes we tend to exaggerate. We tend to exaggerate the implications. I think that the bipartisan relationship is strong. If you look both at President Trump and at the candidate of the Democratic Party, Vice President, as we understand, we know that there's a strong friendship, that Biden is a close friend of Israel. We look at his record. We know that he's a strong friend of Israel. He supported Israel, and he's categorically stated that he will not, for instance, condition aid on all kinds of policy issues, and that he will continue the friendship with Israel. And they even in the platform of the party, they decided not to mention occupation and not to condition. So there is a strong friendship in both parties, and we must recognize this. People, one party tends very often to criticize and try to diminish the Israeli support in the other party. And I think it's a mistake. We should see the support of Israel in both parties. That does not mean that we shouldn't be concerned about radical elements, which can come from all parties, from the left and from the right, from the center and from everywhere. You have radical elements that are anti-Semitic or anti-Israel or in all different directions. So we're aware of these issues. We have concern, and part of our activity is reaching out, bridging the gaps, and making sure that the mainstream of each party is very strong in its alliance with Israel and its support of Israel, and against these horrific radical elements. That is part of our duty here, and we work with all elements of all the parties in order to maintain that understanding. That does not mean that we don't have radical elements. So just like we have anti-Semitism coming from the left and coming from the right, and we have to fight it and battle it. So also with the relationship with Israel. That is a key issue in our work here in Los Angeles as well.
Okay, before I turn it over to Dan Gold, because you're very smart, and because I was supposed to be in Israel in March, when will I be able to buy my ticket to fly to Israel, Consul General? When can I go?
Oh, it's, at the moment, Israeli citizens are allowed to fly to Israel. American citizens who do not have Israeli citizenship, they have to put in a request. And at the moment, the policy is that you need a special reason. In other words, if there's a family festivity, or God forbid, a mourning of some kind, if there's something which is timely, then Israel will be forthcoming and considerate and allow the visit. If it's not something that is depending on specific time, it's just a visit in order to tour the country or visit relatives that you've not seen for a long time, then Israel might request that you postpone the visit until we see a light at the end of the tunnel of the COVID. I think that there will be light, the end of the tunnel of COVID, quite soon when vaccinations are developed. President Trump said that by the end of the year we'll have an American vaccine. I believe that by the end of the year we will be on the path to vaccines, whether it be Israeli, American, European, or other.
Okay, so you're saying I can go to Israel at the end of the year? I'm going to hold you to that. Dan, I think you've been monitoring the questions from the audience, so I turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, there's a lot of questions and some of the same questions, some overlap. So Consul General Newman, the first question that a lot of folks are asking is, how much role did the United States administration play in helping create this deal? The administration is taking credit for it. I believe the latest news, actually as of today, is that the agreement will be signed in Washington with Prime Minister Netanyahu coming to DC for that. So how much credit can we give the United States administration for this deal?
Yes, Prime Minister Netanyahu will be visiting DC next week, and the signing will most probably be on the 14th of September, which is next week. So as you can see, things are moving rapidly forward. Regarding the US administration was a key player in bringing about this peace agreement and moving forward. I mentioned before that there were concerns, and these countries need to feel trust and confidence that they have a true ally in the United States and in Israel. And this administration managed to bequeath that trust and confidence that was required in order to move forward. The UAE and other countries that are thinking about relations with Israel have very serious reservations about what might happen to them, whether it be attacks, open attacks by Iran, whether it be attacks by radical Islam. There are all kinds of players out there that can do them damage. Also the ramifications in the Arab street. So they need to feel this comfort. They need to feel in a comfort zone in moving forward. And I think the key aspect of this US administration was that it gave that feeling of comfort, trust, and confidence. And was built on the fact that also the United States took a stand on Iran. It was required that you have a clear policy on Iran, that you're not going to tolerate the malign activity of Iran in the region. And there are a few aspects that played together that gave this confidence. And the US administration also, with the Peace to Prosperity deal, which was put on the table, managed to bring together a summit in which participated many Arab League countries and Islamic countries that do not have diplomatic relations with Israel. And the administration managed to bring them together at the same table with Israel. So this was a sign of the fact that the US administration had taken this seriously to move peace forward.
Thank you, and that's a perfect lead into a follow-up that some of our participants have, which is specifically on the Trump Peace to Prosperity plan. It's been reported that one of the components of the agreement with with Israel and the United Arab Emirates would be that Israel would stop its plans for annexing any land in the West Bank. what that has not been, whether the reports are true or not, where does Israel currently stand on the Trump peace plan with this agreement?
Yeah, we are totally in support of the Peace to Prosperity plan. That doesn't mean that we accept every single item in the plan. It means that we accept it as a foundation and a base for peace. The basic thing is for each side to come to a plan which is proposed and say, we accept, but we accept this, we don't accept that. The problem with the Palestinian side and some of the Arab countries is they never make a counter proposal. They never come to the table. They just reject, and that's it. They don't even give an opening for peace. So we have always extended our hand in peace, and we have the same with the Peace to Prosperity deal. We have accepted it as a basis and a foundation for peace. We have our reservations about specific items here and there, but we regard it as a very good basis for peace. And the reason why we regard this as perhaps one of the best bases for peace is the fact that it brings realism. In the past, the paradigm was always built on Israeli concessions for Palestinian agreement to recognize Israel. And Israel gave concessions, gave territory, and never received the peace. The whole paradigm of territories for peace. Israel gave territories and never received peace because there was no tangible demand from the Palestinian side. There was no demand from the Arab side. It was always Israel pays the price for a hope of something ideological or theoretical. What the Peace to Prosperity is, it brings realism to the table. It says, this are the contours of a peace deal, and both sides must accept the contours of the peace deal. And that was also the idea of moving the embassy, recognition of Jerusalem, and moving the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, a promise which was made by many administrations and respected by this one. The idea was to present to the Palestinians realism and say to them, there are some things that you will have to accept in a future peace deal with Israel. And that is, one, you'll have to recognize Israel. You'll have to recognize Jerusalem as a capital of Israel, because there's no going back on those issues. The biggest obstacle to peace was this allowance that was given to the Palestinians and the Arab world as well, not to recognize Israel, not to move forward and have a veto on every demand. Any demand that they placed forward, there was blind support for their demand. So at last, we have a situation where realism is brought into the arena. Regarding the what we call extending of sovereignty, we don't call it annexation, because annexation means you're taking land from someone when it doesn't belong to you, it belongs to someone else. We don't believe that's the situation. Yeah, the best scenario, it's disputed territory, but it is the ancient homeland of the people of Israel, and we're prepared to relinquish territory for peace. That does not mean that it never was Israeli homeland. But in moving forward, they're part of this realism in the peace process, and Peace to Prosperity is also understanding what will be Israeli territory and what will be Palestinian territory. The contours should be clear. And the idea of the annexation was to extend sovereignty to those lands which, according to all understandings, will be Israel. According to the Trump proposal, even according to previous proposals that were put on the table by Clinton and others. The idea was to set a new reality and knowing what will be Israel and what will be a Palestinian entity. Bring realism into the process. We have suspended it temporarily. It's now temporarily, it's taken off the table, but it's suspended, and we may go back to it according to future developments.
Thank you very much. Some participants are, with follow-up to that, even, wondering, when it was reported that Saudi Arabia and maybe other countries in the region have said that they won't engage with the deal with Israel until the Palestinian issue is resolved. They're still kind of sticking to that. Based on everything you said, are they telling Israel what that now means to resolve the Palestinian issue? And is Israel working with them to do so?
Yeah, the entire Arab League made their decision that there will never be peace never be normalization of relations until there is peace with the Palestinians, until the Palestinian issue is resolved. And we see that decision is now integrating. So I wouldn't take big declarations to the end. Declarations can also change, policies can change. We have discussions with many countries. Saudi Arabia, you can see clear signals coming out of Saudi Arabia. First of all, Saudi Arabia allowed the flight from Israel to the UAE with Israeli symbols and emblems on the flight, and allowed the flight to cross its territory. And now they've announced, immediately after that flight, they announced that there will be no more restrictions. So Israeli flights with a dogtail with the Israeli sign and flag can fly over Saudi Arabian territory. This is unprecedented, and it's a clear signal. It doesn't mean that we're going to sign peace tomorrow with Saudi Arabia. It just means that Saudi Arabia is prepared to move forward in giving legitimacy to the state of Israel and recognizing facts of reality that have to be recognized. I think that in the future, we will move forward in all directions. I cannot name Saudi Arabia specifically and tell you when.
Thank you. Another element of this agreement that's been talked about in the media has been the idea that the United Arab Emirates would receive F-35 aircraft. It's been some speculation whether that's true or not. Can you give any insight into that and what that means for Israel and the United States?
Sure. Well, once the declarations came out of the peace, then immediately the whole deal of the F-35s was floated as if it was part of the deal of UAE making peace with Israel and getting F-35s. So our Prime Minister made it very clear that F-35s was not part of the deal. In other words, this was not an understanding. There's no understanding here that for them making peace with Israel, they will receive the F-35s. That does not mean that the United States does not have the privilege and the ability to make a decision to give F-35s to UAE. That's an American decision. Now, the United States of America gets many requests for armaments and for modern equipment. And we have a committee that sits, a joint committee between Israel and the United States, in which we discuss these kind of requests. Requests like these are raised to the committee, and both sides have the opportunity of voicing their opinions. So Israel can voice its opinion of whether it's against or in favor of a deal on F-35s or any other modern equipment that UAE or any other country may request. But in the end, it's a United States decision. As the United States makes its own decision, it doesn't have to respect Israel's opinion. It listens to Israel's opinion. Sometimes it does respect it, sometimes not. So we don't have veto power on this. So it's a United States decision. I would like to say also that, there is a US decision that Israel's qualitative military edge will always be preserved. That's the QME of Israel's qualitative military edge will always be preserved is also bipartisan in the United States and agreed upon. And I think that any decision that the US administration takes on this issue in consultation with their security apparatuses will take that into consideration. They will consider well whether such a deal will affect negatively Israel's qualitative edge. Not every deal means that Israel's qualitative edge will be affected negatively.
Great, thank you. Just a couple more. There's a lot of questions coming in, but we're gonna end with a few more, and I'll have have some of them overlap with each other. Overlapping the idea of moving embassies and this deal, has it been announced where the UAE will put their embassy?
No, UAE has not committed whether it'll be Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. We don't demand that. Just the fact that they open an embassy, we'll be very glad, because it'll be moving forward in normalization and mutual recognition. They have not committed whether it'll be Jerusalem or Tel Aviv.
And is there any expectation that this could help change the tide in the UN? Has Israel started to talk about that with other members of the Arab League, or specifically with the folks in Dubai?
Well, some have given up hope on the UN. We have not. We believe that there's still hope for the UN. But I'll tell you where the UAE can tell us a lesson about the UN. The UAE shows that these countries have interests. And these countries are prepared to change policy for their interests. And every country prioritizes, and every country has a wish list. And if we cater to the needs of these countries, then we might also see a significant change in their vote in the UN. Let me draw on my experience as ambassador of Israel to Uzbekistan. It's a Muslim country. And when I arrived there, I realized very soon that there's tremendous pressure on this country to cut its relations with Israel from Iran and from the radical regimes that hate Israel. And they're out there and they work diplomatically. And very often they put money on the table and they say, here, take millions of dollars, just cut your relations with Israel. And that country then has to make a decision according to its priorities, what it does. And what will make it decide to forego these millions of dollars and go with a relationship with Israel or a United States of America. And it's a mix of things, and you must also all the time make sure that it's in their benefit to have relations with you. That's part of your task. You must make sure that it's well worth it for them. So I think that UAE got a confidence that it's worth it for them. It will be of benefit for them to have good relations with the US and with Israel. And these type of equations can also change votes in the UN. I'll give you an example. Very often we've said that the US should prioritize normalization of relations with Israel as part of their bilateral discussions with countries. Like for instance, when the US goes to a country in Africa that does not have diplomatic relations with Israel, and that country has a wish list, a large, long wish list with the United States. If the United States would say to that country, look, normalizing your relations with Israel is a prerequisite, is a condition for getting all your requests, then you will see a change in normalization of relations with Israel. So it's also a matter of the determination of an administration and prioritizing issues. And the same goes for UN votes. If we will make this an issue and prioritize them in our bilateral and multilateral relations with countries, you'll see changes in the UN vote as well.
Thank you. I'll sum it up with two final questions. The first is looking at the globe, and there's certainly a rise in anti-Semitism around the world. In some countries, including the United States, you could say there's a rise of white supremacy and white anti-Semitism. How does Israel look at those emergencies in different countries, whether it's looking at places that Israel wants to have an agreement with, or is maybe helping the United States? How does Israel look at that issue and get involved to be helpful?
I understand you're referring to other countries, not the United States.
Well, yeah, I'm trying to combine into one. There's questions about countries like, in Eastern Europe that may be having some of these trends, but also in the United States, we see it. How does Israel monitor and make their policies similar to how Jay was asking about Sudan when it comes to white supremacy and this, these more radical right-wing governments or groups?
Yeah, let me say globally, I think Israel is one of the very unique countries that morals and ethics do play a place in our bilateral relations with countries, especially in relation to the Jewish community. It's very rare that a company will put on the table issues which are uncomfortable, which are not pleasant. So Israel does that in its bilateral relations with countries, even at the highest levels, whether it be president, prime minister, foreign minister. Israel brings to the table issues which are unpleasant but have to be dealt with. And it can be restitution of Jewish property, for instance, after the Nazi era. It can be anti-Semitism, which is growing in the country. There can be many freedom of worship for the Jews in the country, etc. And Israel is there to stand for the Jewish interests of countries and will raise these ethical, moral issues, even if they may be an obstacle in our bilateral relations with these countries. Now, for instance, if you take Poland with the Holocaust law and the path that it took, it became a big element in our relations with Poland. And we even reached a situation that we sacrificed things in our bilateral relations because we stood on the moral and ethical aspect of respect of the Holocaust. So these issues are raised on state level, and moral and ethical issues sometimes do become even larger than the interests of the bilateral relations. Regarding white supremacy and radicalism, of course, we're deeply concerned about it. We're deeply concerned about all the Jewish communities around the world, the United States and elsewhere. And we should be aware that anti-Semitism comes from all sides, from the right, the left, and the center. And Israel will be there to fight it.
Great, thank you. And final question coming from the audience quickly, just how much is the COVID-19 scenario changing diplomacy, changing the way the countries are looking at each other? You referenced it a little bit with the UAE. Does it come into play with places like China? The expectation that there could be a vaccine that everybody needs to share, that maybe issues that people thought were big, we're now shifting on where priorities are. How much is that playing? Can you speak to that as a final question?
Sure. I think that COVID-19 will bring about shifts, especially in the economic order. We don't follow these doomsday theories that the entire global world will change. We don't need to exaggerate, but there will be shifts in economic order. And for instance, things that we see have changed recently might continue and be long-term. We'll see a shift towards automation, less globalization, more a nation-state economy, less global chains, more local chains. There will be changes, and significant even changes in economic order. In that aspect, as I mentioned before, modern technology, artificial intelligence will play a very large part. We'll see this shift towards automation and streaming and touchless devices, tele devices. This will be the future. This is the direction of the future. Robotics, those are the future. And with that, I would just say that with the jobs that are being lost now, we can also be confident that there will be a new future of new types of jobs, which will reach into the future, like these streaming and cybersecurity and automation and other fields of interest.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you very much, Consul General, for your honesty and for representing so well Israel in Los Angeles during these complicated and difficult times. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Next week, a week from today, I'll be doing a webinar with City National Bank's Russell Goldsmith about the economy and what we should be thinking about both individually and communally. I hope you'll join us. And I hope you reference our website, www.jewishla.org, to see all the extraordinary work our Federation is doing, leading this community through this pandemic. Again, thank you, Consul General, and I hope everybody stays healthy, and I wish everybody Lashan HaTorah. Thank you.
Shana Tova, thank you very much, Jay, and we wish the Federation all the support we can offer in these difficult times.
Thank you.